so I'm going to start. I'm going to give a little background, and then I'll come back to Professor Rahayu's questions about Indonesian journalism. I'm not an expert on Indonesian journalism, but I do have some comments that I can make around what the topics you've raised and brought up. So just to start with where my research began, I have to go back to 2012, which is now 8 years ago. For many countries in the world, it was the global financial crisis that dealt a really strong blow to journalism, and particularly in the Anglo-American world, so in USA and in the United Kingdom. There were a lot of newspapers, were really significant layoffs. I think something like 90,000 journalists lost their jobs in the USA just in 1 year alone. In the UK, it wasn't quite so many, but very significant workforce reduction. And of course, consequently, a reduction in the news supply. So this was associated, as I say, with the global financial crisis. But it started to raise questions that really hadn't been asked before about the state of global journalism employment and what was the variation, for example, between employment in the global north and employment in the global south. And were these problems of workforce reduction atypical? Were they just a product of adverse global economic circumstances? Or were there patterns of precarious employment in journalism across the world that were ongoing, that they were very common? And this was sort of interesting in Australia because Australia has a highly concentrated media market. We have an oligopolistic media market in the sense that we have only a handful of major media companies, and they are controlled by, there's literally, for example, in newspapers, we have three main companies. News Corporation, which of course is a global organisation that started in Australia, but now has its biggest operations in the USA. Fairfax Media, which was our oldest and longest established news organisation, which actually now no longer exists. It was taken over by a television company, Nine Entertainment, in 2018, and so now is merged as part of, newspapers are produced by an entertainment company in that instance. And then we have another television company, Seven West, that runs newspapers in Western Australia. We have a community newspaper network as well. But what I'm talking about is that for a country of 25 million people, we have 4 major newspaper companies. So it's a highly concentrated market. And therefore, if you lose your job or you want to change employers, you don't have very many options. In fact, you've got 1 or 2. So it was very interesting to us in 2012 that both the major companies, News Corp and Fairfax, made a decision almost at the same month, in June 2012, to switch from print first news production to digital first. And literally overnight, they decided at the end of June, okay, we're going to digital first. Fairfax cut its staff by nearly 2,000 and News Corporation by a similar number. And we had this absolute kind of, if you like, disruption of the production of journalism that was based on the technological innovation as the first instance that was then related to workplace reorganisation, and that was then related to a shift to what we call audience-driven editorial agendas. And with that shift, there was just a massive reduction of personnel. And surprisingly, perhaps it was the most experienced, the most expert, the most respected journalists that, in a sense, were asked to leave first. And so there was a kind of a brain drain out of newsrooms at the same time. They weren't asked to leave first. That's slightly incorrect. There was a voluntary redundancy process, and many journalists were encouraged to take the opportunity of getting a quite good payout to leave the company, particularly those over 50. So for journalism, this seemed like almost a mortal blow. To lose your most senior journalists, your most expert veteran reporters who had the most capacity to hold power to account, if you like to say it that way, or in other words, to scrutinise the administration of government, of power, of business, and so on. And what was quite sort of bizarre about it was that the news companies themselves absolutely rejected the idea that this massive loss of workforce would in any way affect their news quality or editorial standards. So there was this very strange dynamic in which what looked from the outside as really the reduction, the closing down of what had been very important news resources. The narrative from the companies was, oh, don't worry, on digital media, you know, there's plenty more sources and there's more interaction and there's more audience participation. And these are the sorts of aspects of news production that we want to encourage. We decided, a group of us, of academics from 6 universities decided we'd investigate this, and we created the New Beats project, which the blog is on the screen. It's now been running for 7 years. And our aim, we had many aims, but our major sort of interest has been to look at how journalists who've been laid off have experienced that process, but also how they've reinvented their careers and what do journalists do after they're laid off from a full-time secure job in a newsroom. Now, the example you gave, Professor Rahayu, was that journalists were opting out. They were saying, we're not going to wait to be dismissed. You know, we want to leave. That also happened in Australian newsrooms, particularly because once, you know, so many staff were laid off, working in a newsroom was a terrible experience. There were too few journalists, there was too much work, there was a lot of changes in the organisation of the newsroom and of the production of news. The newsrooms moved to 24/7 production cycles. So this always on, you know, there had to be people on shifts all the time. And actually working in a newsroom became really a very, very difficult and exhausting, stressful experience. And so it was quite interesting that I mean, this has been an ongoing process. There wasn't just one workforce reduction. It's been a continuing process for the last 8 years. But it has been interesting to see that actually younger journalists who are recruited enthusiastically from university, get their jobs in newsrooms, are actually given quite a lot of responsibility for digital sites, for innovative new types of reporting. After about 2 or 3 years, they're kind of looking at each other going, well, you know, this is all too hard. This is too hard, too stressful. And if there are opportunities to leave with a voluntary redundancy, some of them do. So the pattern that you're describing, I think it sounds like it's slightly similar in that where once newsrooms were large, big staff, very collegial, very collaborative processes of producing news. Certainly in Australia, increasingly, there's a lot of automation. There's much fewer staff around, and the workloads are really, you know, they're very intense. So that's kind of, I guess, one factor to keep in mind. When we started to drill down into this idea of how do journalists reinvent themselves, we came up with some very interesting findings, which I'll just share briefly with you. The first thing that always came up was, well, if you lose your job as a journalist, do you get a job in public relations? Do you move across to, if you like, the other side of news reporting or news making, which is, do you become part of the production of sponsored content or content that serves clients rather than the public interest? Now, from our study, and we tracked 225 former journalists across 4 years of surveying. So from our experience, while there were a number who did go into public relations, which in Australia, the public relations sector employs about 200,000 practitioners, whereas our journalism sector has historically, or in the last 10 years, employed around 20,000, maybe up to 30, between 20 and 30,000. So, you know, only 10% of what is of the number of people employed in PR, marketing, advertising, and those areas. So initially there was some leakage, there was some crossover, career change into that sector. But to our surprise, there was also this incredible kind of sense of, well, I might have lost my full-time permanent job, but I'm still a journalist and I still want to do journalism. So I'm going to go find some other work. Now, as I said, there's only really a couple of companies. So the first strategy was to go to the competition. Another strategy was to look for move platforms. So if you've been a newspaper journalist, you might switch to television or radio. We don't have a big radio sector, but television can absorb a lot. Or there was interest in startups. Now, Australia doesn't have a big digital startup journalism sector. We, for the most part, have the digital platforms that we have are actually subsidiaries of major global digital news providers, such as The Guardian, Huffington Post, the Daily Mirror, and so on, BuzzFeed. And in the last year, we've lost a lot of those. We've lost the Huffington Post, we've lost BuzzFeed. So there's really a reduced number. So what I'm trying to say is, in the Australian context, digital news platforms, we do have, you know, a dozen or so, but that sector hasn't been able to absorb all the journalists who are looking for work in digital journalism, nor is there a very strong economy in digital news platforms, largely because I think probably like Indonesia, our advertising market is completely dominated by Google search and Facebook sharing. And in fact, Australia is in the process, I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but our ACCC, the Australian Competition and Consumer Watchdog, is currently mandating a new policy that will force Google and Facebook to pay for sharing news, so that the news publishers who are facing basically, I mean, their revenues, their advertising revenues are you know, really quite minimal compared to what they were 10 years ago. This is a bid by the federal government to get some revenue back into the sector to save it from collapse. It's very much that the sector is on the point, or I mean, it's a little bit dramatic to say, but market failure is not an impossible sort of scenario unless there's some push back against the big digital players and their kind of capacity to capture so much of the ad revenue. So It's a bit of a long narrative, but what I'm trying to get at is that at first there was this sort of fear that if you weren't a journalist, you'd have to go to PR. That didn't actually happen entirely. There was a lot of journalists who found other places in the news ecosystem. But as time has gone on, and particularly this year with the pandemic, the corona or COVID-19 pandemic, there's been an absolute collapse of media advertising in Australia. And we've had News Corporation, for example, has now moved its whole suite of regional news mastheads. All the print production is gone. They've moved their whole system to digital. And the rural and regional news network that I mentioned before, ACM, that stood down its staff for about 5 or 6 months. It closed a number of mastheads. So the net, if you like, production of news or news supply at the moment has really dropped dramatically. It's something like 183, 185 masthead closures and other sort of reductions in newsrooms in the last 12 months alone. So on top of the fact that work in newsrooms has become extremely stressful and intense, you now have the reduction of the number of news suppliers. And this means that journalists, you know, who want to maintain their profession are now in the freelance market, or what I think bloggers are really freelancers. So I'm going to use that term to cover all sorts of what we might call journalists who are engaged or employed on very precarious types of contracts. So that's a casual, a part-time or short-term contract, or gig work, you know, just, you know, get paid to do a single job. And in looking at that sector, what we've found is that actually you can no longer analyse freelancing in journalism without actually looking at the increasing rate of precarity, of work or employment precarity. So there was, even 5-7 years ago, this idea that to be a freelancer was a work-life choice. It was a decision that, you know, you didn't want to have a full-time job because you wanted to have alternative, you know, you wanted to spend time with the family, or you wanted to have a life where you weren't on call, you know, 24/7. And so there was this sort of sense that some people did freelancing because it was flexible, because it gave them choices around, you know, what type of work they did and when they did it and how much they did. I think it's fair to say that freelancing is now becoming, in a sense, one of the only work options available to many journalists. So even though journalists might spin a narrative that this is something that they are opting to do, I think if you look at the contextual pressures, I think you find that, yes, it might be an option, but it's an option when there aren't many other options at all. So it's kind of a forced option, I think, rather than necessarily something that journalists see as a lifelong career option. I think that sense of a lifelong career in journalism is fading quite dramatically. So that's not something that students want to hear, particularly students who are keen to get into journalism. And I certainly don't want to leave the impression that it's the only option available, particularly to newcomers. The news industry loves newcomers, the fresh energy, the fresh kind of engagement with the skills and the sector and with sources and so on. So there's many benefits to being a newcomer in the news labour market. But yes, freelancing, I think, is something that students of journalism should start thinking about now, because there are many ways to do freelancing, and the more you can really start to plan, if you like, what your optimal or dream freelance career would look like, I think the better placed you are to actually go into the labour market in a way that you can drive your own career a bit more than just kind of waiting for someone to tap you on the shoulder and say, oh yes, I've got a job for you. So I've moved through quite a few topics there, and I haven't really said anything about Indonesia, but I want to say something. I want to do two things. I want to just point you to this resource. Can you see this? So there's a lot of great research tracking what's happening in journalism across the world. And one of the most extraordinary projects is this Worlds of Journalism project, which has been going since 2007, hosted by some very distinguished journalism academics in Germany at the LMU University in Munich, Thomas Hanich, who actually is well known in Indonesia. He visits there quite regularly. His partner is Indonesian. So he initiated the project, and this book has just been released this year. Ooh, there we are, Worlds of Journalism. And the website that I'm showing you has country reports, but it also has all the data from this research. Now, the research mainly focuses on journalistic cultures, and it's very interested in role perceptions and influences on role performance in journalism. If I go to Indonesia, so there's a 6-page report which gives you background on journalists in Indonesia, and you can see that the authors, or the author, beg your pardon, is Nuhaye Mukhtar, who's at the Indiana University of Pennsylvania, but there's another colleague, Mazduki, who's from
he is our colleague. He also worked with us through the webinar about journalism too.
Okay, so he would have written this report based on the surveys that are documented here, and they've given country reports specifically so that you can go in and have a look at what's happening in Indonesia from the perspective of scholars who know Indonesia, not someone like myself who's an outsider. And I think you'll find that there's some really good, this is written in 2016, so it's not right up to date, but it's certainly got enough, I think, information that you'd find really useful in thinking about what's happening in the sector and, you know, what you can learn from it in terms of your preparation for journalism work, but also understanding pressures, you know, what pressures on ethics, pressures on autonomy, what sort of interference and influences are exercised over news work, and what the sort of transition process in Indonesia looks like compared, for example, to Argentina or Australia or Bangladesh, just to name another country. So really rich resource, and one that I really recommend because I teach comparative media, and one of the things that I most encourage students to remember is that most people think that the media in their home country is what the media is like all around the world. And it's only when you start to say, okay, well, I'm going to have a look at Mexico and see what journalists are up to in Mexico, and then I can compare it to what's happening in Indonesia. And you might be surprised at similarities and you might be surprised by differences. But what you start to build is this very diverse picture of what's going on in journalism. And for me, as a scholar researching this, it's highly productive, both because you can see those news environments that have threats that might be, say, political, versus those where it's actually economic poverty or lack of a advertising market, which is related to the lack of a strong local economy. Or it might be technology. You know, does Indonesia have good digital infrastructure? You know, is the digital capacity for journalism that's shared, is that supported by good technology? So yes, I really encourage you to have a look at this resource. And as I say, the 6 pages on Indonesia, I'm sure you'll find really useful. And you can, if you like, compare them directly with the research. I think it's Volker Hanich has done the research on Australia. Internationalisation has been a really big part of the New Beats project. We have partners in the Netherlands, Indonesia, USA, Canada, South Africa, Finland, Sweden, the UK and Brazil. We started internationalising from about 2016, and to me, it's been one of the most productive parts of the research we've done. The book that we're producing at the moment highlights the sort of interest in understanding job loss in journalism across the global north-south divide. And I wanted to show you, if I can, now, this was a public event in which our project was presented to journalists in Melbourne, but I particularly wanted to highlight that we had our Indonesian collaborator, Mr. Samiaji Bintang. He participated in this roundtable. I'm not sure if you know Bintang. Yes, he is the executive director.
I have a webinar with him like in the last 2 weeks. Yeah.
So he's the executive director of the Institute for Press and Development Studies in Jakarta. And in this press conference, he was explaining that, and I think this intersects with what you were asking me from the start, Professor Rahayu, that Indonesian media do not publicly report industry job cuts. In fact, it's very difficult to get data in Indonesia about job losses, in part because, and he was talking about journalists who'd lost their jobs in 2018 due to newspaper closures. He suggested that many journalists see job loss as a disaster, a personal disaster, and something that they find humiliating and they don't want to talk about. So another dimension of the narratives that you were raising at the beginning, which sort of suggested, oh, I'm moving on to other things. I think it might be reasonable to suggest that that kind of positive narrative might be, I don't know, I'm just speculating here, but it might be related to whether they have lost jobs and are not, you know, wanting to draw attention to that, because as well as the sort of sense of, if you like, humiliation, there's also worry that if you admit to having lost your job, having been sacked, that you won't be able to get another job. And that's very common, not just in Indonesia, but in Australia as well. So researching job loss amongst Indonesian journalists has been very difficult for Bintang and his colleagues. And the other thing that he did mention, which I thought might be of interest to your students, is that the media industry shift to digital news sites has, he said, focused on trying to attract younger readers. And he suggested that that trend may have left many older journalists with very poor job prospects, because there's a sense that they do not have either the digital skills or the kind of ability to talk to young people or to engage young people in discussion of news, because they've got their old-fashioned ways, to put it like that. So I'm very interested. I'm not sure what capacity we have for sort of discussion, but I am very interested to hear the views of you and your colleagues, Professor Rahayu, on how you see news industry transformation in Indonesia. And do any of these themes that I've raised resonate with your sense of what's going on?
Okay, can I jump in, Penny? Yeah, thank you, Professor O'Donnell, for our colleague who just joined our discussion today. I will briefly review what Professor O'Donnell has presented to us. In Australia, Professor O'Donnell highlighted that Australia has oligopolistic media industry. There are only 4 big press company in Australia. So if you are fired, then like somehow it's finished. Your career is finished, because not so much option for journalists in Australia. And the digital technology has forced senior and most qualified journalists in Australia to retire. That surprised me. In Indonesia, we also have a press company force early retirement, they call it. So early retirement for those 40 years old and above. So if in Australia, journalists 50-year-old and above should retire, in Indonesia it's 40, so younger than that. But in Indonesia, the case is for junior, I mean like not for senior and qualified journalists, but for the those in the early career are forced to quit the job if they reach 40. Yeah. Yes, I agree with you that now journalism profession is offered for young generation, not for senior journalists. The case which I said to you, a media company in Indonesia having 3 editors and only 1 full-timer journalist, the rest are freelancer. So all of the full-timer journalists and all the freelancer are young people. So there is an understanding among press industry owner in Indonesia that young people know better how to create content for young people. So so it reduced the opportunity for senior qualified journalists somehow. And also, Professor O'Donnell also mentioned that, yeah, it is interesting, the idea that the company reject the idea that the decline in the number of journalists in the newsroom have no significant impact on the quality of journalists. Yeah, but how later maybe you can add, like, how is your study? Is the quality of journalism still good, or is there any study to measure that in Australia? Later you can confirm to us. And then Dr. O'Donnell also said that market failure is possible. It's not nice to hear this, but this is the fact. Print production has all gone in Australia, all moved to digital media. In Indonesia, we still have the print version, but not so much in demand. And then this is interesting when Dr. O'Donnell said that Australia Competition Authority forced Google and Facebook to pay. And I would like to hear more about this. How is the method to do so? Because in Indonesia, our Ministry of Finance have long asking Google and Facebook to pay for tax, but they keep finding way to deny this obligation. Yeah, so what's the strategy that the Australian government do to achieve this, so that we can learn from Australia? So in conclusion, there has been an increase in work precarity, yeah, in many sectors, and in the press industry, there is a tendency that long life career in journalism has been fading. This is sad to hear that. I hope our student from journalism don't like feel this. Don't give up. I think this is a challenge for us to find a solution of this situation. Yeah. And finally, my question maybe also to Dr. Penny is that how then, if we see that freelancing is being the only available option for journalists, yeah, that it is also on the freelance, even for the freelancing opportunity is mostly for young journalists. How do you think journalism need to be regulated in the future to protect the working condition of journalists? That's maybe Professor Penny can respond later. Okay,
Yes, so
maybe
there's a lot of threads there. Let me clarify. We do still have print versions of some newspapers, but it's digital first production, so everything's put up online as it happens, and it's really the print editions are really for older people who have that habit of getting up, getting the paper in the morning, reading the paper over breakfast. And obviously that demographic, while, you know, they're going to keep the print edition sort of alive, that is a practice that will fade out, clearly. I think the sense of gloom and doom around what's happening to journalism, I think it's real, and I think it's appropriate in some ways, because there is a lot of change, and a lot of the change is negative, and it is making the work of doing journalism harder under worsening work conditions, more pressure to produce, not necessarily regular pay, and also a kind of sense that it's almost like a privilege. You know, it's almost like, well, you've got a job, what more do you want? A sort of sense that, you know, if that's how journalism is now, just get on with it. Looking back, or stop trying to invent that it should be done a different way. Just get on and do it. I think in this kind of question of how to maintain, if you like, a sense of optimism, but also a sense that journalism can still be done well, I think it's really important to start to consider what are the factors or the criteria by which we judge journalism as journalists and as journalism educators. What do we see as the role of journalism? Because there is no, if you like, universal definition, and there is no one way to do journalism. Journalism has always been an evolving practice, one that very much has to adjust to the political, economic and cultural or social contexts in which it operates. So while it is absolutely factually correct that it is becoming more difficult to get work, to get well-paid work, and to get work that actually supports the production of high-quality journalism, all of that is true. By the same token, people are still very interested in information. There is still an audience. There is still a big demand for information. And I think it's important to keep those two things in balance. You don't do journalism just to produce. You do journalism because journalism creates an interaction, a conversation, an engagement with an audience. There is no journalism without audiences. And fortunately, even in the era of fake news and all the attacks that there have been on journalism, particularly in the context of populist political leaders, the thirst for news has not disappeared. trust in quality news has not disappeared. And it hasn't disappeared amongst the younger demographics as much as it hasn't disappeared amongst older demographics. So it is very important to keep these things in perspective. And one of the things I always encourage students in particular who are sort of emerging into the field or getting ready to participate in the field, make a point of looking for excellence in journalism. There's a lot of criticism of bad journalism, and there's lots of bad journalism. But when you focus on excellence in journalism and you make it your business to know the 3 or 4 really excellent journalists who are producing news in your news market, and to follow what they do, and to understand and examine and detail, you know, do really investigate what they do and how they do it, and who works with them and who pays them, and, you know, how much of their work is done, you know, for a general audience and how much for a specialist audience and so on. If you focus on excellence, you find excellence. There's plenty of really good stuff being produced. In the Australian context, I think, I'm not sure whether this story made news in Indonesia, but the 2 journalists who won the Gold Walkley, the highest prize for excellence in journalism this year, were journalists who had pursued the Afghan war crimes committed by Australian soldiers. They had pursued that story for years, and, you know, they were subjected to some really tough kind of treatment from the Australian Federal Police and from government and so on. They weren't the whistleblowers, but they were the people who listened to the whistleblowers. And ultimately, as I say, they won the highest prize in journalism in 2020. So, yeah, we've got to keep that sort of sense of, yes, it's difficult, but it's not impossible. Regulation, I think, is one of the really tricky issues. And I think it's kind of a sign of the times that we are now looking at the regulation of the platforms of Google and Facebook, rather than what have been, across the world, there are very different approaches to media regulation. In many jurisdictions in the global south, journalists are, you know, you need to be registered as a journalist to work as a journalist. But there are other jurisdictions in the global north where, you know, any sort of regulation is seen as an attack on press freedom. I think increasingly in the digital platform era, it's actually where regulation is starting to become a big issue is around advertising, so revenues, and then around sharing, and who is, if you like, responsible for hate speech, for grotesque video violence, for pornography and other sort of other types of content that seems to be free-flowing across platforms. You know, that is where there seems to be energy for regulation. And I think I'm not saying that that's something we should just applaud without further consideration. I think what I'm getting at is that questions of regulation have, in a sense, moved away from news producers, the journalists and media companies, to the news distributors, meaning the digital platforms. And I think that shift is very complex, but it's extremely interesting, because we do tend to think of the platforms as technology neutral, and there is nothing neutral about the technology. Technologies are socially constructed, and algorithms are not, you know, neutral. Algorithms are designed specifically to capture certain sorts of behaviours, audiences, and so on. I mean, the clearest example is that fake news generates much more traffic and revenue, even by having a label of fake news, than any other type of content, you know, circulating. It's a bit of an overstatement, but the point I'm making is that platforms are making a lot of money out of content that journalists would, you know, never consider to be journalism. So that vicious cycle has sort of seems to be unstoppable. So your question was, how is Australia doing it? I've put the latest news article up on the screen so you can have a look. It seems like Australia is leading the field on this because we have a very brave head of the Australian Competition and Consumer body. But ultimately, it's the Australian government who's saying, yes, this has to happen. And so it's going to be a law that forces them, the two companies, Google and Facebook, to pay news organisations for access to journalism. It's going to go to Parliament today, in fact. I haven't heard what the outcome has been. There's other legislation, industrial relations legislation, that's also on the table today. It's something that there's been a lot of discussion. The final report into digital platforms came out last year, and this was part of it. So it's not new. It's something that Google and Facebook have both reacted against. I think Google's a bit more resigned to doing it. Facebook is much more, you know, outraged and not wanting to be forced into this position. So yes, I mean, I'm not entirely across, as I say, what's happening in the Parliament. I do know that there is a lot of political will, unusual political will, to do something, and that the reason to do something is the alternative, as I say, which isn't talked about very much, but there is the potential for market collapse of our national news media if this doesn't go ahead. The crisis in advertising has been around now. It's sort of 6 or 7 years, and you know, it's not going away. That said, I mean, our newspaper sector still is worth around $2 billion annually. That's down, I think even 5 years ago, it would have been $4.5 billion. So there's been a big drop, but it's still making money. But yes, going forward, this is seen as something that has to happen. Oh, here it says, what happens if they don't reach agreement? Yes. So I'm happy, if you would like, I can put together a little package of the news and commentary on that and send it up to you, if that would be useful.